Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is a Damian James hosted webinar on behalf of the Society of Construction Law in Africa. The webinar is being recorded, so there will be access to this at a later stage. Today, I'm joined by Advocate Marcia from Group 33 Chambers in Pretoria. Marcia and I have collaborated in the past 12 months in our mentorship programme, the culmination of which was the publication of our article and the subject matter of this presentation. An interesting point, and I never fail to tell people this about Marcia, but she's also a qualified pilot. And when the need arises, I know she is available to fly to hearings in South Africa. Equally, I'm delighted to say that we're also joined by Mr. Eric Dunn, SC, from Maisels Chambers. Eric is the editor of the Association of African Arbitrators Journal, Arbitrarily Speaking. It's a pleasure to have you both here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damian.
Thank you.
Our two guests today are going to discuss the article that was published in Arbitrarily Speaking in December 2023, which reflected upon climate change and changing climates, and spoke in both narrow terms and broader terms in respect of the issues that those in the construction industry and in the economies in general are going to face with the changes in climate. From a construction point of view, we talk heavily about contracts, we talk about adverse weather conditions, we talk about inclement weather, and we ordinarily talk about where the risk and ownership for that weather normally sits. Now we're talking about a future and a present, which very much is changing on the old norms and the old traditions of how weather was considered. And it's the aim of the article very much to develop the process and the thought process for the future so that we can look at the effect that climate change will have on projects and contracts in the future. The format of this presentation is going to follow with Marcia leading us through the article with a PowerPoint presentation. I'd encourage you to place any questions that you may have within the chat box, allowing our presenters to discuss those questions at the end. Equally, in advance of today, you should have received a copy of the article. However, if you do require a copy of the article whilst we are in the discussion, then please provide me your email and I will make sure this is sent to you. But for now, I'm going to hand you over to Mr. Eric Dunn. And again, we're delighted to have Eric with us. He's going to provide you with an introduction to the article, the reasons for its inclusions in the Association of Arbitrators Journals, and he'll then introduce our speaker, Miss Marcia Davitt. Very much hope you enjoy today's webinar. Thank you, and over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Damian. Good afternoon, all the invitees. Hello, Marcia. It's nice to be able to have this discussion with you, especially after having had the privilege of reviewing your article for inclusion in Arbitrarily Speaking. I found the topic to be a very interesting one, and it is quite obvious that weather is going to have a huge impact on not only on society, but in a smaller realm, of course, the construction industry worldwide. Your article deals with the issue of weather, both from a macrocosmic point of view, where the UN is involved in it, and it also deals with it, on a microcosmic level. And that is where you, through a series of mitigation and adaptive steps, try to mitigate the risks. What inspired you to write the article, just as a matter of interest?
What inspired me to write the article is because I'm studying my PhD in climate change, actually. So it's part of my PhD studies, and with me being Damian's mentee, I was really inspired by the work that he does, and it really aligned with what I was doing and what he does. So from both ends, it made sense to just collaborate and just speak in one voice, obviously from different industries.
Wonderful. No, that was just on the side. Lovely to hear that you're doing your PhD in this. It's such an important topic. Of course, I think it was about 2007 somewhere, when Al Gore, the former vice president, also I think he was given a Nobel Prize for his work in this area, and with a movie that he had, an inconvenient truth, made us all aware of this. Now, the reason why your article was included in Arbitrarily Speaking is obviously because of its huge impact on everybody and on the construction industry. How do you envisage the impact of climate change can be mitigated in this particular sphere? How do you see this happening?
Well, Eric, it's a very tricky one because weather unpredictable, but one can plan. Obviously, you can use baselines, but as we have spoken before, where do you draw the line with baselines? You can look at the patterns, obviously, and plan accordingly. But at the end of it, your contract is the most important document that you have to look at the clauses, what you agree upon as parties to the agreement, and how to mitigate or even adapt to that. And obviously, mainly to share the responsibility, because now no one is at fault here. When it rains, when it thunders, it's an act of God. So the only way we actually to mitigate is to just have harmony between the parties on how they're going to approach this.
But you will have to get access to data, available data, all the available data to draw a baseline.
Yeah.
And of course, that baseline, I think, could move in the future as the weather patterns become more unpredictable.
True. And you work from a worst case scenario. I mean, you can have the data there, but what if it becomes drastic? I mean, maybe if it rains and maybe the next year it rains heavily. I mean, you plan for the worst.
But it'll always be a scientific driven approach that you would have. You will always garner data as you go along, keep that data, and then adjust it for whatever situation you are going to be dealing with.
True, I agree.
Marcia, just to get to the article specifically, because that's the first part of it. So governments, through the efforts of the UN, are galvanizing their efforts to tackle climate change. Obviously, that's something that has to be done. And are they getting to the point where we need them to get to?
I think it depends where you place. I mean, for instance, us as South Africa, we are a developing country. We've got our own targets on how we're gonna get there. Obviously, looking at our history, but I think we're slowly making progress in other areas. But I'm not sure if we're really making much progress in the infrastructure side of it. And I think there's much work that needs to be done there. As I said, when we started off, it's climate change and it's unpredictable. And I think there's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done there by government in collaboration with different stakeholders. There's quite a bit of scientific knowledge that needs to feed into government policies. And I think that's where they need to really make progress to engage everybody in that decision making.
The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change differentiates between developed and developing countries. And I think there's a reason for that. What are the requirements that a country must comply with to be regarded as a developed country vis-a-vis a developing country in terms of the climate change framework?
I mean, I think if I can pull one out of the hat is, where are you with socioeconomic resources? I mean, that's where you look at. I mean, what have you done, or what the countries of South Africa? Apartheid plays a big role. Infrastructure still backwards, people, poverty also. We still need to really win that first. So you need to show your economic muscle. Obviously, can you do it? And that's why we've got a trajectory, the peak, plateau, and decline, South African trajectory. We work on that to say, well, at this point, we cannot really meet those ambitious targets, but we are willing to get there slowly as we address other issues that are more prevalent in our society. So you need to actually show the history of the country is very important, and what have you done in the past to actually address certain things.
Your article refers to a country having a higher adaptive capacity. And it says for that, you've got to have a stable and prosperous economy. And you list 4 others as well: a high degree of access to technology, well delineated roles and responsibilities for implementation of adaptation strategies, systems in place for national, regional, and local dissemination of climate change adaptation information, and an equitable distribution of access to resources.
Yes.
Obviously, the better you gear to achieve those conditions, the better you would be placed to combat climate change.
You're right. 100%. I mean, out of all the ones you've listed, that's why at the top of the list, it's the economic part of it. I mean, if you haven't won that, you cannot actually go far as anything. So you're right. I mean, we need to make strides there. We cannot really try and be like a developing country and try and have ambitious goals there when it comes to climate change impact.
So we've got to strive to achieve all these conditions if we want to have any chance of being able to combat climate change effectively.
100%. 100%.
Now, given that that the climate is going to affect us all, and you can't, as you indicated earlier, one can't say what is precisely foreseeable today. You've got data, so you can foresee. You can foresee what is probably predictable today, and you can make an assessment of that, and that will influence your decisions both in the short and medium terms.
Yeah.
But how does one go about determining the outliers, the probability of these extreme weather conditions that are unleashed in various parts of a country? It makes it more difficult because one part of the country, in one region, you have a particular set of weather conditions, in another part, different weather conditions, and you've got to combat all of that. How would you suggest one would go about determining the outliers for extreme weather?
It's a very difficult one. I think even the scientists are still trying to grapple with that one. So it's an everyday struggle, Eric, to really pin down how to really combat that. But as the only thing we have is to have data and keep getting data and have that baseline. I mean, investigation into the weather patterns is the only source we have. I mean, we have to investigate and to see how frequent that change and how it can impact on the work that we do ground level. So it's a very difficult one actually to really answer.
But it would be based on developing weather patterns over the world and scientific predictions as to future modeling of those weather conditions as they relate to different areas and different continents, etc. Is that not so?
Yeah, that's why I mentioned investigation and scientific input is very important, and obviously that talks to data at the end of the day.
And then getting specifically down to construction projects as such, what would your views be? How best would one be able to, for all the parties in a construction project? So you've got various parties, you've got employers, you've got developers, you've got the contractors there, you've got project managers. How how best would you think they should go about undertaking this task?
I think with what we've mentioned in the article is about careful planning and actually bringing all parties together to say, this is the situation, this is the project we're embarking on, and this is the contract that we're entering into. The clauses are very important. I mean, that when what happens in the worst case scenario. So I think when parties agree and come together and realize that if anything happens, they can come together and not one part will be blamed for anything. So mitigation is the only way that they can actually tailor their agreement to actually suit everybody.
Eric, you are a senior counsel, you sit as an arbitrator, and obviously these issues are going to come before you in the future, come before you in the past. In previous times, obviously the situation in terms of pandemics arising under contracts wasn't something we particularly talked about, but we've seen it definitely seen it over the last 5 years with the COVID situation. But before that, we saw it with the Ebola and the SARS breakouts. Before that, they sat probably as neutral events and something that couldn't be controlled. They now sit as events where I don't want to say employers want that risk to be taken or shouldered by the contractor, but there's a definite situation in terms of where the risks now sit and how the contract deals with it. And yes, the major contract clauses won't change in that respect, but special conditions may change, and it may see a shift in. If climate change and adverse weather becomes the norm, do you see it being similar to that process, that it now sits into the bracket of a contractor's risk, or has to be defined by way of employers and contractors?
Damian, I think there are two answers to that. The first one is everybody, and let me start here, everybody immediately thinks of force majeure clauses. And force majeure clauses, just in general, are designed to excuse performance of some or other kind, because here's an act that has intervened and you're unable to perform some or other obligation, and consequently you want to be excused from that. Now, COVID, the pandemic, and I'm going to refer to pandemics in general now. We know that there's another pandemic predicted around the corner. Bill Gates said this is only one pandemic, and we're referring to the COVID, and the next one is around the corner. How are we going to deal with those? I think one will have to make provisions in, and I don't think one must go to the necessarily to the force majeure clauses, because you don't want to stop a project from proceeding. But if your workforce is prevented from going on site, who must, and this is, I think, where you were heading to, who must bear that risk? My own view is that with this type of situation, one shouldn't expect the contractor or the employer to bear that risk singularly. This is a collective responsibility, and I think they must both share that risk. I think that's how one should approach it. And of course, there must be amelioration measures of some kind to protect workers against this. And if it means that for a certain period works are suspended, then so be it. But the cost of suspending the works are enormous. But that should be a shared cost. That's what I would think. I don't think you can cast that on a contractor, and I also don't think you can singularly cast it on an employer.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It ought to be a project risk, and obviously the ramifications and the permutations of what transpires from something such as the pandemic has to be shouldered by the party who's best placed to do so. I think, what you normally see is when you start to shift risks to the contractor, because the employer in their own mind think that they are not accepting the cost, they don't want the cost of that risk. There's a danger, and I think this is part of my question, there's a danger then that the contractor starts pricing the risk into his tendered price, in his contract price, So inadvertently, the employer actually pays for those items. I think one of the things that I often see with weather, there may be a period of 10 days of downtime where there's no weather. But obviously, when we've talked previously, we used the example of the dam wall being damaged by the washing away of the half-built construction, etc., causing further ramifications, more damages, etc. And yes, it sort of strays into a position of remoteness and consequential, etc. But probably in the employer's mind, if he gave the risk for all of that to the contractor, then you would probably find contract prices increasing, wouldn't you?
Yes, of course. And of course, if you expect the contractor to bear that risk, he's going to include in his tender an increase in across the board of various elements of his pricing. And that will make projects become inordinately expensive.
Yeah, absolutely. And you wouldn't have a measure on what that price was unless you were going to write a contract and put an item in there as an undefined provisional sum to say, please allow for dam wall collapse because of a washaway. And somebody might price that at $1 million. Someone might price it at $10,000. That you'd have big differentials between the commerciality and the commercial reality of something that may or may not happen.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's correct.
Okay, thank you. Marcia, are you nearly ready, or shall I tease one more answer out of Eric?
No, I'm ready.
Okay, well, you're not off the hook yet, Eric. I will come back to you on another question, please.
Fine.
Okay, with you, Marcia, now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. So I'll be talking to who shoulders the risk of climate change in the world that is changing. I mean, we all know that climate change is here and it's changing the way that we do our work. Damian, nice slide. I mean, we have to find ways to actually do our work. Obviously, as I mentioned before in my introduction with Eric, that we need to introduce mitigation and adaptation measures to actually arrive at this. And companies have been doing a bit of work on their part, I mean, by using sustainable and durable, innovative materials to arrive at that. So embracing the new construction industry as we now know it to be, to actually adapt to the climate change that it's within us now. So, and it all starts with us having to educate ourselves. I mean, from every party in the agreement, I mean, from the employer, you need to know actually that if I really embark on this project, what can I expect? What is the worst case scenario that I can expect? And obviously there'll be delays, and who can actually shoulder that? And if you really obviously need to think, it's not only the contractor's responsibility, as we've mentioned probably in our article, to say that as a contractor, when you want to take on a project, you need to actually have to calculate your risk first, investigate the weather patterns, and decide if you really want to go with this contract because of the weather patterns that are changing that might impact on the project. So we need to really educate ourselves. We cannot sit back with that. Next slide. So as I've mentioned, there is the impact on construction projects because it's so highly labor intensive and we cannot really avoid it. It's causing major economic concerns, and especially when you are a developing country and you want to actually work on infrastructure, you already have issues of social impact issues, and your economy is not great. And now you've got climate change that you have to really try and adapt and mitigate against. So it's another thing that we need to look at to say that there's concerns of economic concerns, and the weather patterns are unpredictable. No matter how much data you can collect, there's ongoing investigation, scientific investigation that must go on, and you can plan. Obviously, as I said, usually one needs to plan for the worst. So compared with traditional buildings, green buildings are more expensive to build. I mean, if you really want to take a step into mitigating, there is a cost element that you actually need to look at. And unforeseen costs could arise, such an increase in workers' compensation cases, so it's actually puts a strain on the project itself economically, but there is no any other way but actually to try and mitigate that. I don't think there's any way that one can really move away from the economic impacts if you try to mitigate against climate change. Next slide. The impact on construction projects as I continue with this topic. So the unfortunate reality is that the more weather-related there's disasters that we come across. I mean, you have huge floodings, droughts, and now things that we've never actually seen before in the past. And these are increasing intensively worldwide. And it's really affecting each and every sector, especially the construction industry. So, and another one is the construction industry, as we know, it is highly labor intensive. It's dependent on skilled labor. You cannot do without that. So we haven't actually arrived at where technology we can actually build without warm bodies on the ground. We're still far from achieving that. So that's one impact. And it's important for one to create the safest job site possible when you actually try to mitigate against climate change. Next slide. Now, when we come to the safeguarding against extreme weather conditions, it's very important to have a digitalized checklist or a safety plan for easy access. I think paperwork, we're actually moving away from having paper as one of the things we can rely on or reference. So when you need to have it on the go, so you can actually have it on the cloud, easily accessible. And that's one of the things that we need to move forward with. And you need to have a very successful site action plan. It should be very detailed. It must be written plan. And it must have clear deliveries on what is expected when there's an emergency or a disaster that happens. And the crew must actually be a priority when there is possibility of actually extreme weather changing conditions, because there is people's lives might be endangered. So how do we actually make sure that the safety issues are taken care of? So that's the most important thing that one needs to safeguard. Next slide. It's very important, I think, with every industry or every country, because when the Paris Agreement gets entered, the government actually enters into that agreement, and it starts there at the top. That messages for decision makers is for them to actually do more. As we know that buildings are responsible for more than 40% for global energy use, and that's quite a lot actually when you look at it in the bigger scheme of things. And the government must take the lead in prioritizing building sector in their national climate change strategies. And I think government are slowly moving towards that. I think developing countries, they've got obviously their own targets on when they're going to arrive there. Developed countries are almost there with the resources that they have available to them. And you can actually, it's very visible. You can see that in their policies, and implementation is actually not stagnated. So as I've said, most countries have already taken steps to actually try to curb climate change. And as we know that buildings have a relatively long lifespan, therefore actions that are taken now will continue to affect the greenhouse gas emissions over the medium term. So mitigation, and I think part of adaptation plays a role there. Next slide. And with another decision-making point is the buildings blocks must be in place. And this talks again to government taking steps in actually having policies, and a policy must be a live document that changes of when there is a need for change. I mean, for instance, climate change is unpredictable. So it must be a living document that changes every time when there's a need for it to actually adapt to the situation at hand. And there's a need for international cooperation within government. And I think that happens on a daily, when we have to really try and find ways to mitigate and implement the Paris Agreement now domestically in South Africa. Unfortunately, right now, the Climate Change Act is not yet in place. We still have it as a bill. That actually causes a bit of things not moving fast enough. So we're still at the back foot right now as a country, but we will slowly get there. And obviously, this will bring multiple benefits to both the economy and society when that happens. So there's a lot of collaboration that must happen on an international level and domestically for governments to actually come together to try and implement these strategies and try to curb climate change. Obviously, that impacts on infrastructure, and how do we mitigate going forward? Next slide. So in the end, what one is to look at is that climate change contributes towards delays. And it's important for, as I've mentioned when I started with the presentation, that it's important for parties to really sit and really look at the contract clearly to say, what are the terms we're going to agree upon? What are we not going to implement? Should we have extreme weather conditions that delays the project? So, and another thing I will emphasize is very important to keep accurate records. Should there be extreme weather conditions on the construction project? And I will emphasize again to say government needs to take the lead in prioritizing the building sector. So in a nutshell, it's everybody that needs to actually come to the party in when it comes to construction and actually trying to curb climate change. So climate change is everybody else's problem. So when an incident happens, everybody else must come and say to the table and not blame each other to say, well, there's a delay and I'm not going to pay. So there is a need for the contract to be very clear and the clauses to be read very carefully by all parties before signing. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcia. Maybe I can sort of start interrupt before Eric comes back on and just give him a little bit of breathing space there. I mean, in terms of from a purely contractual point of view, from those of us who work in an industry of construction where disputes are commonplace, etc., and we use these words inclement and we use the words adverse. Do you see a situation at some point in the future when those words will be reframed and the contract clauses will be talking to a contractor who must allow for climate change, or a contractor who must allow for high variables and not to expect the norm, and then it's just a dumping or a depositing of that issue onto the contractor? So, I mean, obviously, adverse and inclement might not exist in the future if climate change goes at the rate that we expect it to or we're told to. So do you see a situation in the future where those clauses will start reflecting this high variable that we all sit with in different climates?
Most definitely, Damon. I mean, there is no way that things will remain the same. We are now here faced with extreme weather patterns, and obviously there's delays everywhere, and they will be, then language will definitely change, without a doubt. I don't see why it shouldn't, because if you are faced with a situation and you still have the old way of doing things, it doesn't move parties forward in addressing the issues. So I definitely think it will change. And and in most developing countries, you see that changing slowly in their clauses of contract. Mostly in England, I've seen one contract where they actually have clauses where that talks to climate change. So people are actually very aware of what's happening, and they're actually doing something to mitigate that.
Yeah, I think the other issue for me is obviously in terms of any delay or stoppage on a construction site where there is a heavy density or a very dense resource-based workforce, and you see that with foundation work, you see it with concrete beams, concrete columns, concrete slabs, reinforcement. There are a vast amount of resource available or required to do the work. I mean, in construction, it's been my life for 35 years, and I think construction companies are always capable of being innovative, etc. And innovation sort of tends to come from off-site work being used, and it would help prevent situations like that, albeit you might not be able to still install the off-site work. But do you see a situation where there might be rewards for contractors for providing innovative answers to construction methodology and bringing in precast concrete slabs instead of having 40 men at the workface pouring concrete in wet weather conditions?
Yeah, no, 100%, Damon. 100% agree with you.
Okay. Eric, can I draw you back in? We do have some questions now. So maybe before we take some of the questions, is anything you wanted just to further with Marcia on the back of her presentation?
Thank you, Damian. Marcia, you referred to the, I think, greenhouse emissions coming at about 40%. I've seen higher calculations than those. I've seen up to 70% from of course building and operations of infrastructure. But buildings have different footprints, and when the government gets involved, as I hear you suggest that they must become involved, do you foresee that there would be some form of rating that would be applied? And if so, what sort of rating system do you have in mind?
There will be actually some rating that the climate change, the Paris Agreement gives way for that, to say you need to have emissions targets. How much do you emit, and how do you actually try and regulate that? So I wouldn't actually try to guess how much we should actually do that, but there should be a way that we curb the emission targets. So it's a very difficult one to actually really answer, but as we committed internationally in the Paris Agreement, there is no way that we can actually get out of that. So we need to try and find ways to curb the emissions.
So the reason I probe this particular aspect is this, because as I indicated to Damian at the outset, it seems to me that there are two levels at which one can look at these problems. The first level is because I think concrete itself contributes to about 7% of greenhouse emissions, carbon emissions.
Yeah.
I mean, that's actually phenomenal if you just think that concrete does that. Now, you refer to new technologies, which is one of the ways of combating that. But one will have to have a rating system if you're going to look at the impact of a building as such on the environment. That will be the one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is, how does one protect the process of developing a building from the time that your foundations go in, or whatever, foundational work you do for a structure, whether it's a dam or whatever you're constructing, protecting that. And for that, I would suggest you need some changes to the project specifications.
True, you're right.
Would you agree with that?
I agree. Just to take you back to your question, the Green Building Council, I mean, that's one of the one of the councils that actually look at the ratings. When you build according to their specifications, you get a particular rating, and obviously there's ways that they can actually put you there, and your electricity, you how you recycle your water, how you renewable energy. There is ratings to that. You get 5 green stars once you've complied with the way that they need you to build innovatively to curb the greenhouse gases. Sorry, Eric.
I interrupted you.
No, it's fine.
So that's to reduce the impact of the building that is being constructed on the environment. But on the other hand, to protect buildings that are being constructed from the environment, you also need protective clauses.
Yes.
I cannot necessarily envisage that the generic clauses that you find in the usual construction suites like FIDIC or NEC would necessarily be amended to accommodate climate change as such. I suspect that the way in which the drafting committees of these construction suites would go would possibly be by minor amendments that will allow for very specific project requirements to be implemented. In other words, in the detail of the project, because every project is going to differ, and you cannot take a generic contract and adapt that contract as such for a project.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll find this in the underlying contractual development documents, if I may put it that way.
Yes, 100%. I agree with you.
Okay, well, if I just interject again, then we do have a couple of questions, or 4 questions really. Just picking up on what you've just addressed there, Eric, Marcia. There's a question here, and it's from an anonymous attendee. Do any of the standard contracts provide for climate change? What about global warming? Are these 2 different concepts? I think it's quite a good question, actually. I've never really thought about it in that manner, but maybe having just spoken about contracts, Eric, maybe you can pick up on that. I mean, in my opinion, that I see weather as weather in those contracts, but maybe there is a definition issue there. I don't know.
I'm not aware of any specific clause referring to climate change in these the construction suites, taking FIDIC and NEC. I know that FIDIC has got a climate change charter, and they are looking at what they are doing, as I understand it, is that they're going to look for templates that they will issue in future. That's FIDIC, to deal with climate change situations. The NEC contracts, Damian and Marcia, you have the core clauses. So you would have, and I think it usually goes to say whatever it is, and then you have a selection of secondary clauses that you can insert. And NEC has got what it refers to as, I think it was an X29 clause. And it's rather unfortunate because it's fairly vague, And they also recommend their users not to use this X29 if there are other clauses that they've already chosen. So, but those are clauses, once again, that relate to, and we must distinguish between the building being brought into addressing the issue of the impact of the building on the climate, and not necessarily the climate on the building.
Yeah, good point. I think you are right. I mean, FIDIC does have its climate change charter. And we have a question here, or the first part of it is a statement from Andrew Officer, but it does lead to a question. And Andrew says, a risk-sharing model of baseline report, which is what you've talked to, Marcia, defining the conditions that the contractor should expect and base their price on. So by conditions, I understand that to mean the weather conditions.
Yeah.
Similar to geotechnical baseline reports, Andrew says, which sounds sensible. And that would ensure equitable risk sharing, which is the point coming back to what you said earlier, Eric. The key here is understanding the meteorological information that sits within that report. So in the same way you would have the geological report, the report is only as good as the information that's in it. Andrew goes on to say that surely the key aspect of the contract that would change would be the baseline conditions. So if that baseline conditions change, such conditions, the hydrological data, wind data, snow data, are based on local meteorological information. This is where the research needs to be focused, as in what data you put into that information to set your baseline. If the baseline expected values change, then the contractual clauses and exceedance limits defining risk sharing may not necessarily need to be adjusted. Alternatively, and I'm adding this to what Andrew says, they may need to be adjusted. So I think what Andrew's proposing is that based on the best possible baseline data you have, the risk can be defined, and it's only in a situation where that data is exceeded by something which is an unusual event, then you can then look at the risk again and say, right, how has that been exceeded, and where should that risk now sit? Yeah. And again, I think that takes us back to the project holding the risk for the changes and the weather. And yes, that might be slightly untenable for certain employers, but it's probably the best place for the risks to be. But what that talks to very much, Eric and Marcia, is having a baseline of information that says this is the best information we have. If it changes from here, then we couldn't really expect that on a reasonable basis. Is that something that you would both cede to and see as being a fair and equitable manner in contracts in the future?
Marcia, do you want to go first?
No, you can go. Fine.
I think that's a fair. Yes. Let me just start off. In general, that sounds like a fair proposition. You use the best information you have. The pricing is done on that. One doesn't know, of course, unless you have access to if you have access to the pricing as the employer, you don't know what sort of risk has already been attached to what is considered to be the baseline situation. So the employer may have attached some pricing risk to that, but what is the extent of that element of pricing that has gone into establishing what the contractor perceives as the risk? Now, something develops beyond that, and you turn around and you say, well, now, employer, we both realized that there was certain information we had, and on that basis, this is what I priced. I'm now entitled to an extension of time and to more money because of the additional risk that has come out of this. But you've already priced something in there for the risk that you envisage. And the question is, what is that element of price that has gone in?
Yes. That's always going to be an age-old debate between employers and contractors. Who owns that money that's been priced into the work for the risk, and the risk doesn't occur, but when it does occur, you keep the money and then ask me for more money as well. So
But I think the answer to that would be that there must be accessibility to that pricing information, and then it could be fair. If you say that I'm pricing on this basis with this level of risk in mind, and this is how I price it, and there's some transparent formula that you can perceive, then I think it is absolutely fair what the listener has put forward as a proposition.
Marcia, have you anything in that respect, or?
I don't want to repeat what Eric has said, but I think obviously he mentioned transparency and having access to that information and pricing. I mean, that's the only way you can actually end the debate. I mean, both parties are now aware what is to come, and if it does come, what is expected, and who's going to be liable for what. So the transparency part of it and access actually is what will actually move parties forward. As from what I can actually move forward to this question.
Okay. So if the answer is in visibility and transparency, which I agree, it must be in there somewhere, and it must go back to that baseline of meteorological information, etc. And this, again, another question from the anonymous person, but this I gather that this anonymous person is a lawyer. So on that basis, and I'll try to use my words carefully, given that transparency and visibility and managing expectations and risks within contracts is a difficult process. But if we think that's the answer, then the question is, seeing that both Eric and Marcia are lawyers, what can we as lawyers do through our work? And I would put that in the context of writing contracts and visibility and transparency, as we've just talked about, to help address climate change. Eric, would you like to go first?
That's a very broad-based question, and it's quite difficult just to answer that very specifically. I think what one obviously has to do, the best thing to do, is to get access to the information, and not fiddle around. This will be my general answer to any question. Don't fiddle with one of the specific contractual suites. Take a cue from, go to their notes and their advisory notes to NEC and to the FIDIC people, and use their guidance on particular changes that you need to bring about to the underlying project documents. Don't fiddle with it. Just see that the topic is generally covered. When I say generally covered, referenced in the overlying or overriding document to the project document, so that the issue is debated there. And beyond that, one cannot give clearer guidance. You really cannot.
Yeah, okay. Marcia, do you have anything to add? I mean, generally lawyers stick together, so.
No, I agree with Eric. I mean, there's no other way of going around it. I mean, sometimes also lawyers need to really not do guesswork, need to know what your subject matter is, and knowing more about the issues like climate change. We don't know everything all the time, but you need to investigate further because you're advising clients. So you can actually do your part by actually educating yourself. But beyond that, what Eric said, 100%, I mean, there's no any other way around it.
Okay. We have one more question before we conclude. And I think it goes into a practical consideration. It goes into a contractual situation. It goes into a commercial situation. How feasible the subject matter of this question is, I'm not really sure. That's why I'd be interested to hear from both of you. The question comes from Anthony Muir, and he says, how can contracts mandate appropriate insurance coverage for climate-related risks, and what types of insurance should be considered essential? I mean, that predisposes that the insurance market wants to start assisting in this type of risk, but just on the basis that they did, then how can contracts mandate an appropriate insurer's coverage for climate-related risks?
Sure.
One would normally, if one takes a large project, there'll be a bidding process. I'm just running through my own thoughts on this, if you don't mind, Damian.
Yeah,
there'll be a bidding process. The employer would request that appropriate insurance is given for whatever risk. There would be fire risks, etc. When you get to climate change, there would have to be an appropriate risk assessment, and I think both parties must have access to those risk assessments in order to be able to stipulate exactly what form the insurance coverage should take. So if you in an area where there are tropical storms that could create a deluge and wash all your building infrastructure away before it's completely erected, and you want insurance coverage for that, that is what you would have to stipulate, and then of course find an insurer to cover that. But that is something that would have to be negotiated with the insurance companies, and I'm pretty sure that you'll have reinsurers. Whoever is going to take that risk is going to need a reinsurer as well.
It's a huge risk, Damien. I mean, I think maybe you'd have, like, I don't know if there's any insurance companies that will take this type of risk to cover this type of projects. I mean, it's very rare because, I mean, what if it happens, you would actually have a reinsurer, because it's a huge risk for one to take, and huge amounts of money that would have to be paid out. So it's a very tricky one here.
Yeah, I guess the other part of it is that, I mean, obviously, I think we're all accepting that there's a huge risk. We're saying that it should be a project risk. We're talking about baselines in meteorological data, given as a baseline for that. And if it exceeds that, then risk should possibly be shared. At what point do you think the risk would start to affect an employer's decision to build? And then we talk about that in terms of new buildings are going to be green buildings, they're going to be better construction, so the economy, the governments, countries need these type of buildings to perform, etc., and we're involved in those all the time. But at what point do you think the huge risk that you can't get insured, you can't get covered by your contract, would start affecting decisions to build? And I guess from parastatal point of view, they might say it's okay, we can afford to do it, but for investment criteria, and definitely between sort of cross-border type investments and investments in different areas, etc., is there a point, is there a marker now that the risk will start to affect decision to build, or do you not see that as a consideration?
While you were formulating that question, I was thinking about you frequently see on the evening news these tornadoes that sweep through areas of Miami and those parts of America, and homes are flattened, and yet they are there for the next round of tornadoes that come through the following year, and they flattened again, and the people carry on building them. I would accept that those insurance companies are probably the best ones to go to get some Q on this, or on the San Francisco fault line. But fortunately, sitting where we are, we have very, very little, risk of that nature. In KwaZulu-Natal, we had a tornado recently that created that devastation. I don't know whether you read about that, Damian.
I did, yeah.
But but the frequency of that will determine how palatable it would be for insurance companies to step forward again and again and again. I don't know.
Okay. Marcia, any thoughts on that situation? Decisions to build? Do you think it's something that governments have to help with, or the world recognizing the climate change? The world has to recognize, and the next time they sit down to make a Paris type agreement, they recognize this issue, that unless we have a separate fund, or unless we have something which helps with this risk, entrepreneurs, commercial businesses, purveyors of products that need to be sold around the world are going to say, I'm not going to make a decision to build in this circumstance because it's going to cost me more than my marginal yield, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it will. I mean, I think they should actually come to the party. That's why we have the climate change fund. That's why there's so much money pumped into climate change funds, so that they can actually help those industries that will struggle because of the climate change impact. And obviously one of them is infrastructure. And in South Africa alone, there is, I think, a policy that's being developed for infrastructure versus obviously climate change, and how to really curb that and mitigate that. And I do think that government needs to chip in, because otherwise nothing's going to be done. People are going to be very despondent or reluctant to actually embark on project, because there is a risk of weather patterns changing or climate change impacting on their projects. So it is actually unfair, because it's something that they can control. However, it stops the work that they have to do.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, we've reached sort of time on our session. We've answered all the questions. I don't know whether either of you want to leave us with some closing thoughts on climate change and changing climates, and where you both feel we are and where we go with it.
Eric, please. Ladies first.
Ladies first. No, I think we all have to do our bit to mitigate and adapt to climate change. I mean, apart from the topic that we're talking about today, each one of us have a responsibility to just do our part to do better. And obviously, when it comes to the construction industry, every party needs to come to the table and actually take responsibility for any risk that might come out from the climate change impact, and share the risk. I see that's the easiest way to do it, to share the risk, because no one is responsible for the impact.
Yeah, my parting thought would be, for many years, there were the naysayers that didn't believe that there was something like climate change. And they just thought that this is a peculiar thing, and it's going to... the leaders, real leaders, like, and I'm just going to say Al Gore again, because he made a huge impact on the world with his form and inconvenient truth. But world leaders need to galvanize and to get serious about this issue, and leave petty squabbles behind, and galvanize not only nations, but institutions within the borders of their various nations, and get everybody serious on this topic, and because it's really going to get bad. The Solomon Islands, as you know, are experiencing dreadful situations where people are losing their habitats. Mm-hmm. It's a really serious problem. We're talking about green buildings and reducing the impact of those buildings on the climate. But there's got to be a serious relook at this, and everybody's got to stand together.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. Thank you very much, Marcia. If there are no further questions, then and you're both comfortable, I'm happy to end the session there. It's been very, very informative. It sits in a very sort of round position in respect of, if we detach one part of all those people who need to be involved in it, then we're going to have a problem. Employers, governments, contractors, the parties to construction projects, the parties to infrastructures, the parties to what the future development plans are for areas, countries, specific areas, etc., it has to be considered in the round. You can't take one part away from it. You can't put too much risk on one party. That is going to affect the whole situation and see us fail in this process going forward. I do think there's probably a case for innovation and more off-site type aspects of work if that is possible and feasible. It's not always the case, but I think that rests with the designers designing buildings better, to perform better, to be constructed easier, to be constructed quicker. Sometimes we don't always need 50 men in a trench with water at their feet fixing rebar and concrete. There could be a different solution there somewhere. So I think that's very much where I sit with it. But if there's no further questions from anyone in the audience, I'd like to say thank you very much to both of you. Thank you, Marcia, for the presentation. Thank you for the article in the first instance. Thank you, Eric, for accepting the article into the Association of Arbitrators Journal. Thank you for your discussion on it. It's been very, very helpful. I've definitely learned a lot from both of you this afternoon, and I'm very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damian, for your
Thank you to both of you. And if you have any further articles, please send them along. I will look at them and gladly publish them.
Okay.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.